Nero killed his mother. But was it power, or fear? There's a question that no dynasty, no philosophy, no human being has ever been able to fully answer. How can a mother who gives everything in love and sacrifice raise a child who one day picks up a knife and kills her? History is full of rebellion, regicide, and assassinations in the shadows of power. But to kill one's mother, not just any mother, but a woman who traded her soul to put her son on the throne, that is not just a crime, it is the collapse of moral order. This is not just the story of Emperor Nero, the infamous tyrant of ancient Rome. This is the story of a woman named Agrippina, once called the uncrowned Empress of Rome. A mother who thought she could manipulate fate with cunning, only to be crushed by the very destiny she helped create. We begin on a quiet night. But beneath the sea, the waves were already rising. Bay of Naples. March, 59 AD. The moon sliced across the water like a silver blade. On the sea, a small boat drifted in silence, carrying a woman both revered and feared by the Roman Empire, Agrippina, the mother of Emperor Nero. The boat was a gift of peace from her son. A sign, so it seemed, of reconciliation after months of cold silence. Agrippina, the woman who once made senators bow, was now returning to her seaside villa after attending a reconciliation banquet hosted by Nero himself. She sat in the cabin. A thin cloak fluttered in the salt wind. But sea winds never lie. In her chest, a storm was stirring. Something colder than the night sea, darker than the waves, crawled across her skin. A gut instinct. The kind only a woman who's seen too much can feel. Something was wrong. Then came the first sound of hell. Boom. The cabin ceiling crashed down like a trap. A maid screamed. Blood spread across the deck. Wood shattered. The boat tilted violently. And sea water rushed in, swallowing the air. The boat began to sink. This was no accident. No twist of fate. It was a cold, calculated murder plot. And the target was the emperor's mother. But Agrippina didn't die. Not that night. Not by the sea. She, once a skilled swimmer in her youth, emerged from the broken wreck, blood trailing from her forehead, eyes burning like fire. Wounded, but alive. She swam. She fought. She survived. When her feet touched the cold sand of Bali's shore, when she lay gasping, looking up at the star-filled sky, the truth struck her like a wave against stone. Her son, the one who had come from her own womb, had tried to kill her. She had changed his diapers. Held him through fever. Through gold, power, and poison to lift him to the throne. And now, he wanted her gone. If you gave birth to a child, raised him to become a king, and he tried to kill you, could you forgive? Comment your answer. 1. I could never forgive. 2. I understand how power corrupts. 3. She created her own karma. We are entering one of the darkest chapters in history. But this isn't just a historical tale. It is a lesson in karma, in ambition, and in how love, when twisted, becomes a weapon of control. There is a saying in Buddhist teachings, love without wisdom becomes a chain. Indeed, Agrippina, full of motherly love, but empty of compassionate wisdom, had chained herself to the will of suffering. Subscribe to Ksitigarbha Tales for more true stories of karma, redemption, and soul awakening. Like this video if you believe that love without wisdom leads to destruction. And don't forget to comment your answer to join the conversation. To understand how a woman could raise a child who became the seed of her own destruction, we must go back. Not to Nero but to her. Agrippina. Not just a name. She was a descendant of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Sister to Caligula, the mad emperor who ruled through blood and terror. Niece to Tiberius, rumored to have murdered her father. Fourth wife of Claudius, an old, naive ruler she easily manipulated. And above all, mother to Nero. Born in blood. Raised in a palace where everyone held a knife behind their back. When Agrippina was just 13, her father General Germanicus, beloved by the Roman people, died suddenly. They said he was poisoned. Whispers pointed to Tiberius, the reigning emperor, fearing Germanicus's popularity. Her mother Agrippina the elder didn't stay silent. She publicly accused the emperor. The result? She was exiled. Starved to death on a remote island, along with 2 of her sons. Only Agrippina survived. Backhand index pointing right, that was her first lesson. Power is not something to respect. Power is something to take or be destroyed. Agrippina understood, in Rome, kindness was a form of suicide. From that moment on, she gave up on love, and chose only one thing, to survive and rule. Ambition does not grow from evil. It grows from fear. She feared weakness. Feared ending up like her mother. Feared being forgotten like so many palace women. So she learned how to control men. At 26, she returned to Rome from exile. She was now a widow. Her first husband, Gnaeus Domitius, known for cruelty, once said, "From me and Agrippina, nothing but horror can be born." Maybe he wasn't wrong. Their son, Lucius Domitius, would later be known as Nero. She later married a wealthy senator, Callistus. He soon died, leaving her immense wealth. Some say she poisoned him. Others say he died of illness. But no one denied this. From that day on, Agrippina wasn't just rich. She was one of the most ambitious women in Roman history. And her goal was crystal clear: to make her son emperor. At any cost. What could make a mother poison her husband, overthrow a queen, and marry her own uncle just to put her son on the throne? 1. A mother's love corrupted by power. 2. A survivor's instinct after losing her entire family. 3. She was simply a demon in human skin. Comment your answer. In 48 AD, Claudius's wife Messalina was executed for adultery. A golden opportunity appeared. Claudius, now old and senile, needed a proper wife. Agrippina saw her chance and didn't hesitate. The problem? Claudius was her blood uncle. Roman law forbade incest. But with a bit of seduction, persuasion of the Senate, and a lot of gold to grease political wheels, the law was changed. Claudius married Agrippina. But she didn't want to be his wife. She wanted to eliminate Britannicus, his son, with Messalina and replace him with Nero. Slowly, but surely, she began to rewrite history. She forced Claudius to adopt Nero, giving him a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. She arranged his marriage to Octavia Claudius's daughter to secure the bloodline. She isolated Britannicus, had him confined, and replaced every loyal servant around him. And finally, she poisoned Claudius, with his favorite mushrooms, assisted by the infamous poisoner, Locusta. When Claudius died in 54 AD, Agrippina didn't cry. She smiled. Because her son, only 17, had just become Emperor Nero. But she didn't know. She had no idea that she had just placed the crown on the head of the very man who would one day kill her to keep it. Nero became emperor at the age of 17. A boy, still wide-eyed, suddenly standing at the peak of supreme power. But that throne wasn't earned. It was handed to him. Not by force. Not by merit. But by schemes, manipulations, and the blood of anyone who stood in his mother's way. In the early days after the coronation, Nero wasn't truly an emperor. He was a shadow. A puppet. And the strings were in the hands of the woman who once called him my son. Agrippina was everywhere. Not just inside the palace but even in the Senate chambers. She sat behind curtains during official meetings, issuing commands from the shadows as though she, not Nero, ruled the empire. New Roman coins were minted with the faces of mother and son side by side, a symbol never seen before in the empire's history. Delegations from the east were required to greet both of them. And at one point, Agrippina even prepared to sit next to Nero on the imperial throne during a public ceremony. This disturbed Nero's advisors Seneca and Burrus. They understood, if the empress mother remained too dominant, the young emperor would never be respected, and worse, a conflict between mother and son was inevitable. But at that time, Nero wasn't strong enough to oppose her. And perhaps, deep inside, he still held some love or at least fear for the woman who once held him through childhood fevers. But power has a gravity of its own. It never stays still. And Nero, once an obedient boy, began to feel suffocated in the golden cage his mother had built. His first rebellion didn't come from politics. It came from love. Nero fell for a woman of low status. She had once been a slave, act. She had no lineage. No title. But she had what he craved: gentle affection, love without ambition. When Agrippina discovered the relationship, she was furious. She refused to let a woman of such low birth stain the imperial bloodline. For the first time, Nero stood against her. Not with shouting, but with action. He cut off her financial control. Removed her loyal treasurer. Then, without fanfare, he asked her to leave the palace, and move to a seaside villa. No farewell. No escort. Just silence as cold as exile. But Agrippina wasn't afraid. She thought it was just childish anger. She had seen emperors lose their tempers before, only to come crawling back to their mothers for advice. But Nero didn't come back. Instead, he began to act like a real man. A real emperor. He hosted private feasts. Issued decrees without her input. And most importantly, he learned to hide his emotions. He understood, to be king, one must not be weak. Not even in the name of love. Not even for a mother. It was then that Agrippina made a fatal mistake. She began whispering to the nobles, suggesting that if Nero continued his ungrateful behavior, she might shift her support to Britannicus Claudius's biological son and the rightful heir. Britannicus was only 14. But that was enough to threaten Nero. He knew, if the Senate or the army ever rallied behind the boy, the throne would shake. Nero didn't hesitate. One evening, at a banquet filled with nobles, Britannicus took a sip of wine, and began to convulse. Panic spread through the hall. But Nero, calm and composed, simply lifted his own cup and said, "Perhaps, it's just another one of his seizures." Minutes later, Britannicus was dead. No one questioned it. No one dared to speak the truth. But everyone knew, the boy had been poisoned. And Agrippina, perhaps for the first time in her life, understood that she no longer controlled the thing she had created. Her son, born of ambition, had become a man without limits. She stayed silent. But inside, the waves began to rise. She no longer craved power. She wanted survival. And in the quiet of her seaside villa, she finally realized something she had never accepted before. No human, no matter how powerful, can control karma. There comes a moment in every young man's life, when first love arrives, and everything about his mother begins to feel distant. For most, it's just a natural part of growing up. But for someone standing between a throne and a sea of blood, it's a revolution. Nero began ruling with full authority. Those who once served his mother, advisors, eunuchs, loyal aides, were dismissed or relocated. He replaced them with new faces, more agreeable, less political, and above all, unconnected to Agrippina. In Nero's mind, she was no longer mother. She was a shadow. A chain that had bound him since childhood. Every time he remembered being forced into the purple robe of royalty, being married to Octavia for political gain, being told what to say before the Senate, he saw himself as a puppet. A soul shaped by a hand that no longer held love, only ambition. Then Poppaea Sabina arrived. She was nothing like Act, the quiet woman on the fringe of power. Poppaea was fire. She knew exactly how much her beauty was worth in the Roman court. And she dared to look Nero in the eye and say, "You're not truly a ruler, if you still let your mother rule your life." Nero was drawn in not just by her beauty, but by how she stirred the resentment buried deep inside him. Poppaea didn't beg. She planted seeds. Seeds of doubt. Do you think your mother might one day try to replace you? When the people look at you, do they see an emperor? Or a boy still obeying his mother's every word? Do you think someone like me could ever be empress while Agrippina still lives? Those questions didn't need answers. They only needed to echo in Nero's mind night after night like dripping water on stone, until the dam finally broke. Not long after, Nero stripped his mother of all remaining privileges. Her closest allies were imprisoned or exiled. Her villa came under secret surveillance. Her letters to the palace went unanswered. Each silence was a silent message. You are no longer Empress Mother. You are a liability. Nero wanted to marry Poppaea. But Octavia, his lawful wife, daughter of Claudius, still stood in the way. The last symbol of legitimacy Agrippina had secured. Divorcing Octavia would tear off the final mask of moral order in the empire. But Nero no longer cared for masks. He wanted freedom from his past. Poppaea knew this. And she used it? You hesitate. Is it because your mother forbids it? Is she still the true ruler of Rome? Then tell me, who is the real emperor? Those words, whispered into the ears of a man who holds ultimate power, but feels no security, were like sparks dropped into a powder keg. Nero made his decision. But the question remained. How do you kill your mother, without provoking a revolt? Because while Agrippina was seen by the court as manipulative, she was still the daughter of Germanicus, the beloved hero of Rome. She had once been empress. She was the mother of the current emperor. A symbol of tradition in a palace drowning in indulgence and blood. A public execution would spark outrage. A trial would seem ungrateful. But an accident? A shipwreck? A tragedy at sea with no witnesses and no trace? That was the plan. A boat was specially built. Its roof rigged to collapse. Its floor designed to split open and sink the cabin. Every detail staged like a play. And Nero, the boy who once trembled in his mother's arms, became the director of her final act. He invited Agrippina to a festival in honor of Minerva. He smiled, laughed, embraced her like a loving son. And at the end of the banquet, he insisted, "Please, take the boat I had restored for you, light, fast, and safe." Agrippina smiled. Maybe she thought her son had repented. Maybe she had forgiven him. Or maybe, she knew everything. But still went. Because she had faced darker plots before. She stepped onto the boat under moonlight, surrounded by applause from Nero's guards. And the boat began to drift out to sea. Life, slowly, began to slip away from her. That night, the sea was calm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The surface lay still, the moon above so bright that even the smallest movements on the water could be seen. In that eerie stillness, a small boat glided through the waves, carrying Agrippina home from the festival to her seaside villa. She sat quietly in the cabin, draped in a pale cloak, her eyes gently closed as if in meditation. No one knew what she was thinking. Perhaps she felt a sense of peace, after finally being received by her son following months of cold rejection. Or perhaps, deep in her subconscious, a vague intuition was rising, warning her that the son she once held close was now her greatest enemy. Half an hour after setting sail, a cracking sound broke the silence. The groan of splitting wood. The snap of coiled ropes. Then, the central floor of the cabin gave way, plunging the lower deck into the sea. One of her mates was pulled under, screaming in vain. Agrippina was thrown violently to one side, hitting the wall of the cabin, but she remained conscious. In a flash, she understood. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't the fury of the sea. It was her son, the very one she had crowned, who wanted her buried beneath the waves forever. But fate wasn't ready to end the story just yet. A large plank floated near her. With a bloodied hand, Agrippina grabbed hold. Her other hand still moved. Wave after freezing wave slashed across her skin, but her will to live burned hotter than the pain. With fading strength, she swam to shore. No one waited. No one called. Only darkness and the crashing waves, laughing like echoes from the past. She dragged herself into the villa at Bali, bolted the doors, and ordered her trusted servant to deliver one message to the palace. Agrippina is alive. When the message reached the court, Nero's face turned pale. His advisors, even Seneca and Burrus, were now forced to face what they had long denied: the young emperor no longer had any moral boundary. If she lived, the truth would spill. If she spoke, the army would divide, the Senate would panic, and the people would rise. So the decision was made. A squad of soldiers was dispatched to Bali. Leading them was Anicetus, the admiral of the fleet, a man who had long held personal hatred toward Agrippina. When the soldiers knocked, Agrippina didn't run. She didn't beg. She opened the door herself. Her gaze was steady. Her voice did not shake. If you've come to check on my health, tell them I've recovered. But if you've come to do something filthy, then do it. I still don't believe Nero would order the death of his own mother. No one answered. A soldier drew his sword. She looked him in the eye, then slowly pointed to her abdomen. Strike here. Into the place that carried him for 9 months. Strike the source of all this evil. And they did. When the final blow ended Agrippina's life, something strange happened. No one shouted, no one commanded. It was done in silence, as if the world itself held its breath, unwilling to acknowledge one of the most horrifying crimes ever committed: a son killing his mother, without trial, without reason, simply because she knew too much. When news reached the palace, Nero didn't shed a single tear. He sat in silence, then asked for wine. When her body was returned for identification, Nero looked at the lifeless form, eyes still wide open, and muttered, "I didn't know she was so beautiful." It wasn't grief. It was a sentence, a quiet, cold indictment wrapped in feigned indifference, or in a guilt already beginning to rot the soul. Soon after, Nero issued an order. The official announcement would say Agrippina had plotted to kill the emperor and, when discovered, had taken her own life. The Senate agreed. No one protested. They were afraid. The blood of Agrippina still stained the guards outside the palace gates. Only one woman refused to believe the lie. Domitia, Agrippina's own aunt, quietly shook her head and said, "In the end, she got the son she deserved." And from that moment on, Nero's nightmare began. He often heard the sound of hooves circling his walls at night. He saw his mother in his dreams, hair wild, eyes burning, whip in hand. He woke screaming, haunted by cries that weren't real, and blood that never washed off. He left the palace, traveled far from Rome, tried to forget. But the past is not something you can leave behind like a discarded lover. Because Nero hadn't just killed his mother. He had killed the last piece of his humanity. After Agrippina's death, Nero thought he had won. He believed no one could stop him now. The throne was his, completely. No rivals. No reminders. But he was wrong. Her death didn't free him. It opened the gates to a world within Nero that even he had never dared to enter, a world of paranoia, guilt, and whispers from the depths of a divided soul. He began having strange dreams. In them, his mother said nothing. She only stared at him from a distance. Her eyes cold. No blame. No tears. And that silence drove him mad. By day, he threw grand feasts to fill the emptiness. By night, he ordered lamps lit in every corner of the palace. He could no longer sleep in the dark. He moved from temple to temple, offering gifts, praying for forgiveness. But how could the gods forgive the one who had stabbed the womb that birthed him? After 3 months in hiding, Nero returned to Rome. But no one recognized him. He walked into the palace like an actor stepping back onto the stage, after the darkest play of his life. He wasn't a man anymore. He was just a performance. A lavish reception was held. Soldiers lined the streets. Crowds cheered. But behind their eyes, there was no reverence. Only fear. Everyone knew Nero was no longer an emperor. He was a wound, bleeding power. He immediately divorced Octavia, the wife Agrippina had chosen to secure the throne. He then accused her of adultery, exiled her, and finally, ordered her death. When Octavia's severed head was brought to Poppaea, Nero's new mistress, she smiled. Nero simply looked up and asked, "Is she beautiful?" No one answered. Day by day, Nero sank deeper into pleasure. Each night of drunken celebration was just another way to escape his mother's stare in the shadows. He ordered festivals lasting 7 days and nights. He dressed as a poet, a dancer, a musician. He sang. He acted. He read poetry, forcing everyone to applaud. Those who didn't, vanished by morning. He loved Poppaea, then hated her. When she became pregnant, she once dared to argue with him. In a fit of rage, he kicked her in the stomach. She died along with the unborn child. Later, he found a boy who resembled Poppaea. He renamed him, had him castrated, and made him his wife. He also married another male slave. This time, Nero played the bride. The Roman palace became a grand theater. And Nero was no longer a ruler. He was a role. But behind the glittering curtains, Rome began to rot. Famine spread. Taxes rose to feed endless parties. Provinces revolted. Even loyal nobles whispered of change. On the surface, Nero was still emperor. But inside, he was just a frightened child. Running from the past. Running from the truth. Running from the mother he had killed, but could never escape. Because when a man kills his own mother, he doesn't just end a life. He shatters the mirror that once reflected his soul. And from that moment on, no one, not even he, can tell what is real, and what is just the echo of mourning, from deep beneath the earth. Summer, 64 AD. The air was dry and suffocating. Even the sea breeze had lost its cooling touch. Rome held its breath. The city overflowed with the poor, driven in by hunger. The officials turned away. And the palace was still filled with music and wine. In this imbalance, all it took was a spark. And then came the fire. On a night in July, flames erupted from the grand market where thousands of families were packed in wooden huts, surrounded by oil and straw. Within hours, the market became a sea of fire. The narrow streets trapped the flames and trapped the people. It wasn't just burning. It moved with intent, as if led by an invisible hand, creeping from rooftops, through kitchens, into sacred temples. People screamed, ran through the alleys. Children lost their mothers. Elders were abandoned. The guards stood still, no one gave orders. Some swore they saw imperial soldiers blocking citizens from putting out the fire. Some whispered Nero started it to clear land for his new palace. But one thing was certain. For 7 days, Rome burned like hell itself. When the fire finally died, 2/3 of the city was ash. Ancient temples, cobblestone roads laid by ancestors, all gone. Tens of thousands were homeless. They huddled in ruins, eyes sunken, staring toward the palace, still glowing with celebration. Nero had been at his private villa in Antium. When he heard the news, he did not panic. He returned slowly. And when he arrived, he didn't offer aid. He wrote poetry. He stood on a high terrace, strumming his lyre, reciting verses about the rebirth of Rome. While beneath the hill, children were digging their parents' bodies from the ashes. They say his voice trembled with sorrow. But the people didn't want poetry. They wanted justice. So Nero found someone to blame. He needed a scapegoat. He chose the Christians. Back then, Christianity was a small sect, labeled heretical, unprotected by Roman law. They kept to themselves, refused to worship Roman gods, refused to swear loyalty to the emperor. Perfect targets. Nero arrested hundreds, staged mock trials to legalize execution. Some were tied to poles, soaked in oil, and burned alive as human torches to light his garden. Others were sewn into animal skins and fed to dogs in the arena. Some were crucified, upside down, in the public square. Terror spread across the empire. But no one dared to speak. Anyone who mourned risked accusation. Rome was no longer the capital of an empire. It became a prison, ruled by a man addicted to fire, blood, and forced applause. And while the city mourned, Nero began building his dream. The Domus Aurea, the golden palace on the land left in ashes. But it wasn't a palace. It was a city within a city. A man-made lake. Hanging gardens. Halls lined with ivory and gems. And a towering statue of Nero himself nearly 40 meters tall. When asked what should be written at its base, Nero replied, "Just one word, eternal." He thought greatness could be carved into stone. But it is blood and fire that carve into memory. He created a new festival, the Neronia. his version of the Greek Olympics. He sang. He raced. He wrote poetry. And he always won. Everyone had to cheer. If someone didn't smile wide enough, they disappeared by morning. Nero believed art would help him forget. Forget his mother. Forget Poppaea. Forget that night when Rome burned, and he sang. But the more he performed, the more he lost himself. He no longer ruled through policy. He ruled through emotion. And those emotions were no longer human. They were sudden rages, random sadness, cruel punishments, long stares in the mirror, unsure of who he was. Rome had never felt so cold. Not from winter, but because no fire could warm hearts anymore. Not after the last fire had burned their trust in the emperor. 3 years after the fire, Nero still sat on the throne. But he no longer ruled the empire. He was hiding inside it. Rome rebuilt slowly. But its people did not. Far provinces began to murmur rebellion. Those once loyal waited quietly. In the palace, handshakes grew colder, replacing hollow cheers. One by one, his torches of loyalty went out. In 65 AD, a real conspiracy was uncovered. Led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Over 30 senators, generals, scholars, even Seneca, Nero's former tutor, were implicated. They were executed or forced to die by suicide. Some were tortured to death inside their libraries, once symbols of Roman knowledge. But even this purge couldn't stop the decay. Because the rot was at the root. No one believed in Nero. And more dangerously, no one feared him anymore. In 68 AD, rebellion spread across the provinces. In Gaul, Governor Julius Vindex publicly called Nero a mad actor, and urged the empire to rise up. His words crept through barracks, merchants' shops, noble halls, and the hearts of those who had lost loved ones to Nero's purges. Soon, Governor Galba of Hispania declared support. He didn't claim the throne. He simply said, "Rome doesn't need an artist. It needs a man." That sentence shattered what little delusion Nero had left. Panic swept in. He called for an emergency meeting. Wild plans were discussed. Burning the entire Senate. Poisoning the city's water. Even setting himself on fire atop the temple of Jupiter as a grand finale. But none of it happened. Because those who listened were no longer his loyalists. They were shadows. They bowed. But did nothing. They nodded. Then went home to pack for the next regime. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Nymphidius Sabinus, commander of the Imperial Guard, promised rewards to soldiers if they backed Galba. And overnight, the same guards who once killed Agrippina to protect the throne, abandoned her son. Nero woke the next morning with no guards. No secretary. No protectors. Just a few old slaves, still loyal out of pity. He searched for help. But the doors once open, were now shut. Everyone turned away. Even those who once owed him everything, couldn't meet his eyes. To them, he was no longer emperor. He was a political ghost. On the morning of June 9, 68 AD, Nero fled to the countryside, to the villa of Phaeont, a former servant. He hid in a storeroom, once a stable. No guards. No priests. No one knew he was alive, except 4 friends, all exiles like him. Then came the news. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. Soldiers were coming to take him alive for public execution. Nero said nothing. Moments later, trembling, he drew a dagger from under the hay. But his hands shook too much. He couldn't do it. In the end, his secretary, Epaphroditus, helped him drive the blade in. As the steel pierced his throat, Nero whispered, "I was a great artist, and now, even art has died with me." No one wept. His body was cremated in silence. The ashes buried in the Domitian family tomb. No state funeral. No monuments. No songs except the sighs of relief from the people. Only one came to his grave. Act. His first love. The only one who had loved him, when he was still human. She lit the final incense. And the story of the emperor who murdered his mother, came to a close. Not as a chapter in history, but as a warning. A child raised only on ambition, without love, becomes a predator in human form. An empire built on a mother's blood, a brother's death, and indulgent lies cannot last. It collapses under the very bricks it once rejected. The Buddha taught, truth needs no defense. But those who reject truth, will surely destroy themselves. And that, was Nero. Emperor. Son. Performer. Sinner. If you've read to the end of this story, take a moment to reflect. What are we giving to our children? Love, with the wisdom to let go? Or golden chains we call ambition? Let not a tragedy from 2,000 years ago become a prophecy for our own time. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone you care about. And follow Ksitigarbha Tales, where we tell these ancient tragedies not to scare, but to awaken.